My name is Eamon Weed, and I'm a sophomore currently studying history and English. Interestingly enough, 4 years ago, I had the delight of meeting this afternoon's speaker at the Acton Institute when I was a sophomore in high school, and it was by mere coincidence that I was asked to introduce him today. And so, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker, Dr. Glenn Arbory. Dr. Glenn C. Arbory is the president of Wyoming Catholic College. He earned his PhD in literature and politics from the University of Dallas. He has taught at the University of St. Thomas, Thomas More College of Liberal Arts, the University of Dallas, and Assumption College, where he held the Dalzahn Chair of Liberal Education. He has served as director of the Teachers Academy at the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, and as an editor at the People newspapers in Dallas, where he won regional and national awards for his writing. In addition to numerous essays and reviews, Dr. Arbery is the author or editor of Why Literature Matters, The Southern Critics, The Tragic Abyss, and Augustine's Confessions and Its Influence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arbery.
Eamon reminded me last night when I saw him that I had tried to recruit him to Wyoming Catholic College 4 years ago. I'm glad now that we didn't get him, since, that's not a coincidence. How could that be a coincidence, right? These things come around. About 25 years ago, Jeff Nelson at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute called me up one day to ask me if I would write a book about why literature matters. Foolishly, I agreed to do it, and now every few years I get an invitation from someone who hopes I have by now figured out what to say. This time it was my old friend Doug Jeffrey. When we were at the University of Dallas, he drove, if not the only, at least the coolest Carmen Ghia in Dallas County. He persuaded me during the blank-eyed lulls of writing my dissertation to read the novels of Ross MacDonald, which I remember with particular gratitude. I add to it my gratitude for this invitation to Hillsdale College, which has been a beacon of independence in American thought, like the signal flare that Homer describes late in the Iliad, that goes pulsing high for men of the neighboring islands to see it, in case they might come over in ships to help beat off the enemy. The question, why literature matters, comes up now once again in the context of liberal education. Even before there were academies, of course, poetry formed the minds of those who heard it. And literature has been, from the beginning of the Western tradition, a central way of educating the young and enlightening their elders. But at least since Plato, it has also been suspect because of its power in forming opinion without the authority of careful argument. So what is its continuing appeal? It's not merely entertainment, though it unquestionably gives pleasure. Even now, literature is a common language for those who are educated, and an ability to move gracefully among literary references to poems, novels, and plays adds to beauty of character. Why literature matters today, however, becomes a particularly pressing question when we think about the graceless controversies that surround it, when it is treated primarily as an ideological tool. Back in December, a piece about #disrupt text by Megan Cox-Gurdon of the Wall Street Journal caused a stir when it exposed the dismissal of the Odyssey by a high school in Massachusetts. Very proud to say we got the Odyssey removed from the curriculum this year, one teacher declared. The teachers in Massachusetts apparently believed that the longer ago the now banished Odyssey was written, the more objectionable it was. They must have imagined an outbreak of hurtful Cyclops jokes, Perhaps the harsh judgment of the marginalized lotus eaters offended them. In any case, there's nothing new in their attempt to get the classics out of the curriculum. The famous hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go protest about the civilization course at Stanford occurred in 1987. And I remember a conference at LSU in 1991 when a cadre of college teachers would not read the Iliad for the seminar because it would be collusion in the European colonization of Latin America. This is sensitive stuff, so better not read the Odyssey either. According to Disrupt Text, young people should read only works written in the present day vernacular, works that promote and center voices that are LGBTQIA+ and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There are many reasonable answers, many reasons why it's important to keep great literature in the curriculum, especially when it requires a challenging encounter with unfamiliar language. Reading a deeply engaging work, older by far than the political structures and racial divisions of the Western world, one that precedes Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle by centuries, not to mention Rome, Christian Europe, and the Americas, might begin to overcome what Alan Tate described as provincialism in time, the belief that this moment of history is the judge of all others. Roger Kimball last night described it as presentism. The sociologist Peter Berger diagnosed the essential complaint against the classics 50 years ago in a 1970 essay called The Obsolescence of the Concept of Honor. He distinguishes societies based on clear roles. For example, the warrior world of the Iliad, from modern ones based on dignity, understood as intrinsic humanity, divested of all socially imposed roles or norms. As Berger explains, looking back from his perspective on the 1960s, quote, the social location of honor in a world of relatively intact, stable institutions, a world in which individuals can, with subjective certainty, attach their identities to the institutional roles that society assigns to them. This is what he understands by the world of honor. For example, in a world of honor, a poet would find writing an ode or a sonnet part of the role of being a poet. And he or she would find it an opportunity for demonstrating individual poetic talent and measuring mastery of a challenging form against past writers. Even romantic revolutionaries like Shelley wrote sonnets. In societies that reject honor, on the other hand, institutions, this is Berger, cease to be the home of the self. Instead, they become oppressive realities that distort and estrange the self. Roles no longer actualize the self, but serve as the veil of Maya, hiding the self not only from others, but from the individual's own consciousness, end quote. In other words, the coercive demands of the sonnet distort or silence self-expression, and the poet should reject any social role that requires submission to such forms. So, for contemporary movements like Disrupt Text, the honored works of the Western tradition have become institutional forms imposed by those who control the canon, oppressive realities from which students must be liberated in order to find their own voices and identities. Berger strikes me as particularly prescient when he writes that the individual who rejects the world of honor can only hope to define himself, quote, in the interstitial spaces left vacant by the institutions. For example, as self-expression in gender identity moves away from all socially imposed roles or norms, its literature tries to dissolve any standard of excellence, not based on dignity or individual self-expression. Ironically, what this means in practice is that writers supposedly in the cultural interstices win literary prizes and prestigious university positions that honor dissent as a new social norm, which makes it hard to describe these writers as anything but the new institutional mainstream. One gets confused. But let's avoid the sirens of grievance. Two reasons that literature matters seem to me most pressing. One is what my teacher at the University of Dallas, Louise Cowan, called cosmopoesis, or world-making, in her introduction to the epic Cosmos in 1984. The second involves literature as the mode of concrete or embodied thought, most natural to the human mind. That is, thinking in images, comparisons, characters, speeches, and actions. The characters and actions of literature are offered to the common judgment of mankind. The best works endure because they most wisely represent human and divine things and give us the pleasure of recognizing our lives in more noble contours. Let me start with the second, literature as a mode of thought. Every household of parents and children has a cast of distinct characters whose various performances become stories in the family. One of our 4-year-old grandsons, for example, though a domestic terrorist by day, sang a beautiful solo of Silent Night on Christmas Eve, much to our astonishment. Every classroom could provide Ben Jonson with examples of the humors, and so could every day in an office. Anyone engaged in managing other people thinks in characters and actions. Who's brave enough to risk the boss's rage over a personal fault that's hurting the company? What will Grove do to handle this slight? Did you see how Pritchett treated that woman? How do you think Klotka will react when we present this proposal to her? This way of thinking is so natural to us that we hardly consider it thought at all. And attempts to reduce it to a system, say in the scenarios of business advice books, always seem naive. The philosopher himself, as Dante calls him, bases his account of virtue in the Nicomachean Ethics not on a set of principles, but on the character and actions of the spoudios, the serious, admirable man, imitated by those who want to exhibit courage or prudence. Novels, plays, and epics work through the depiction of character. At the beginning of the Iliad, for example, only Achilles will stand up to Agamemnon when he brings down a plague on the entire army. And only Achilles suffers the mortal insult of the king. Through his mother, Achilles asks Zeus for the honor that Agamemnon has denied him, even though it will mean the deaths of many and the defeat of his own friends. Both men bring harm to their own army, in other words. But which is more noble, Agamemnon or Achilles? For anyone who's read the Iliad, the answer is obviously Achilles. Saying why takes the reader into the depths of the poem. Later in the Iliad, the Achaeans have been driven back inside their newly built wall, and the Trojans occupy the whole plain. Diomedes volunteers to find out how the Trojans are arranged and what their plans might be. Who does he want with him? on this dangerous night raid? Nestor? Huge Ajax? Menelaus? No, he wants Odysseus, and so would you. The judgment is instantaneous. Why? If you had to tease it out, you'd say that unexpected situations don't rattle him, that he's quick-witted and physically powerful, and that he's a superb liar. We naturally condense what a person says and does, as well as what other people say about him, into a single charged image of who he or she is. It can be wrong. It often is wrong. And this possibility of error also forms part of what literature shows. King Lear banishes the daughter who loves him most. Othello is so wrong about Desdemona, thinking that she has shamed him in his culture of military honor, that he cannot let her live. But even as he kills her, he adores her, praises her, tries to save her from damnation. After he kills her, he discovers her innocence and cries, "Whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight. Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulfur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire." Othello becomes for us a figure embodying many cultural complexities, a part of our thought. Like him, hundreds of other characters from literature become part of the way we think, as though we knew them personally. Clytemnestra, Penelope, Dido, Cordelia, Hester Prynne. Literature helps form judgment and right feeling. In fact, it helps us order experience itself. The accuracy of its depictions may be constantly tested against people we know or might come to know. As a teacher, it never occurs to me to try to abstract a concept from characters like Raskolnikov, Captain Ahab, or Don Quixote, as though they merely stood for something that could be more tidily handled on the conceptual level. In 19th century St. Petersburg, Raskolnikov lives in a milieu of radical social thought, and his mind has been formed by fashionable theories. But unlike many others, he feels the compulsion to test himself by putting these theories into action. There's a kind of integrity in that, even though it involves killing an old pawnbroker. But he therefore suffers the full consequences of what he does. A student learns Raskolnikov, not a concept that he stands for, and not even really the character Raskolnikov, as though he were merely an exhibit of the novelist's imagination. Knowing Raskolnikov pulls the reader into the whole rich social and spiritual context of Dostoevsky's novel. Great characters, like people we've known deeply in our lives, become complex attractors that order and deepen daily understanding. Literature leads us into thinking more deeply in and through our own experience. Literature as a mode of knowledge also involves a deep pleasure in language itself. This would be a good time to put up the poem. And the revelation of likenesses. For example, Gerard Manley Hopkins, in his sonnet, The Starlight Night, thinks in a series of metaphors about the stars. His language is dense with alliteration, full of heavy stresses that form a kind of counterweight to the upward vision, all of this in the imperative mood. Imagine a student used to reading works in the present-day vernacular, suddenly buttonholed by Hopkins' poem. Look at the stars. Look up at the skies. Oh, look at all the fire folk sitting in the air, the bright burrows, the circle citadels there. Down in dim woods, the diamond delves, the elves' eyes, the gray lawns, cold where quick gold lies. Wind-beat white beam, airy abeles set on a flare, flake doves sent floating forth at a farmyard scare. Ah, well, it is all a purchase, all as a prize. Buy then, bid then, what? Prayer, patience, alms, vows. Look, a May mess like on orchard boughs. Look, March bloom like on mealed with yellow sallows. These are indeed the barn. Within doors house the shocks. This peace-bright paling shuts the spouse, Christ, home, Christ and his mother and all his hallows. Now, we could pause over the word quick gold, which Hopkins invented according to the Oxford English Dictionary. Quicksilver, we know, it's the older and more descriptive term for mercury and its kind of jittery liveness. So we make the transfer and see the gray lawns cold where quick gold lies. The cold dewdrops quick with the golden sunlight on the lawns. The stars become the features of this kind of English estate. They flare like white beam leaves tossed by the wind. They burst into sight like doves scared up from a farmyard. And this estate is for sale. Hopkins tells us, buy then, bid then. Buy with what? With prayer, patience, alms, vows. Again, he commands us to look. In the last metaphorical transformation, the whole sky of the starlight night becomes a single structure, if you follow what he's doing in this last part. These are indeed the barn, that is, the whole night sky you're looking at, is to be conceived as this single barn. And inside the barn are the sheaves stored up after the harvest, the gathered saints, let's say. Remember the old song, Bringing in the Sheaves? Right. But these are also, notice the enjambment, notice the way that the shocks is left there at the beginning of that next to the last line. The greatest shocks are those of the unexpected, surpassed hope or understanding. And the greatest shock of all is the last image of immense interior light pouring out through the tiny gaps and holes in the palings of the house of this barn that houses Christ and his mother and all his hallows, as though the whole starry sky were simply a vision of that light breaking through in these tiny places. Why this repeated demand to look as though we had never seen the skies? The Russian critic Viktor Shklovsky wrote a century ago that perception can become so habitual that it becomes algebrization. Wordsworth complains, little we see in nature that is ours. But Hopkins shocks us out of laying waste our powers. Look at the stars. Look up at the skies. He also shocks us from the way that we see dew or wind-blown trees or the flowers on spring orchard boughs. Thinking in metaphors, we discover the beauty of familiar things put next to each other. As Hopkins says in another sonnet, beauty keeps warm men's wits to the things that are. Now, this in itself is already an accomplishment. By the late 19th century, when Hopkins is writing, time and space and divine purpose had all suffered major shocks from modern science. The deep time of geology, the increasing vastness of the discoverable universe, the apparently random adaptation of creatures to environments in Darwin's theories of evolution, and in general, a decentering of man and the human intellect, and a disenchanting of the world outside the Cartesian subject. So what Hopkins is doing here is a bid toward that other dimension of literature that I think we see in what Louise Cowan calls world-making, or cosmopoesis. This cosmos, this world that the poet makes, as Louise Cowan says, establishes the mundus imaginalis, wherein reside the universal qualities that make up the human condition. It's the glory of the poetic cosmos to show these verities in action, embedded in matter, bearing the weight and expressing the hope of the finite order, end quote. A poetic cosmos is a whole apprehended by the imagination, everywhere charged with meaning, a lived world of sky and earth, the living and the dead, cities and households, gods and mortals. It's an interpretive order, a felt world that gives a place to the whole realm of human experience. World-making doesn't mean rhetorically affirming the structures and institutions that are already there, so much as it means subjecting them to poetic revision and scrutiny. For example, think what Homer does in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Agamemnon's outrageous insult to Achilles calls into question the justice of awarding or denying honors when the standards of the one in charge are personal or politically biased. Suppose that someone's greatness exceeds the city's capacity to contain it in its system of social roles and conventional honors. Does such greatness destroy the city or transfigure it? That's the question that the Iliad poses. In the Odyssey, marriage undergoes a major reimagining. The reunion of Odysseus and Penelope doesn't restore something normal. I think we tend to think that here was a marriage of Penelope and Odysseus gets back home and everything's back to normal. But the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope is by no means restoring something normal. Their marriage is establishing a startling, unheard of ideal of fidelity and mutual mindedness. Whoever had a marriage like this one? When Jacques Maritain writes that poetry is an intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self, I think we have to take things to include not only natural ones, but also institutions. I could say more about this, but I want to move on to the idea of what a cosmos looks like by looking at the ancient world, and particularly about looking at the Iliad and the Odyssey next to the modern cosmos that I think we feel sort of adumbrated in Hopkins' poem. Divine presence is everywhere in the ancient world. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, Zeus the cloud gatherer rules the sky, and unpredictable Poseidon the sea. Bleak Hades governs the realm of the shades, the underworld, and far below him lie the halls of Tartarus, where the ancient defeated gods lie in their eternal bondage. So what is the good, Disrupt Text might say, of offering young readers an outmoded cosmos of gods nobody believes in, instead of showing them their own social circumstances in the vernacular? Again, there are too many things to say, but perhaps the most important is that entering an epic cosmos keeps cultural identity and historical circumstance from being a prison. If there's a barrier of disbelief, it's easily overcome. And this poetic cosmos is not closed to us because we inhabit it with the cues of imagination natural to us from our own reality. One scene from the Iliad, there's a line in my book, Why Literature Matters, which ends, well, the whole point of it is that God loves the Iliad more than any other poem. This is why I keep coming back to this. One scene from the Iliad will help make my point here. At the end of Book 8, the consequences of Achilles' withdrawal from the fighting have become unmistakable. Hector has just succeeded in driving the terrified Achaeans back inside the wall that was hastily constructed to protect the ships and the shelters. For the first time in the war, the Achaeans are on the defensive, and Hector exults in his unprecedented success as the Trojans stay out on the plain to prevent the Achaeans from escaping in their ships. They expect to end the long war by the next day, which Agamemnon on the other side had thought earlier in the poem. In this mood, the citizens bring out from the city oxen and fat sheep in all speed, and also the kindly sweet wine with food out of their houses, while the fighting men heap up many piles of firewood. For all the grimness of war, this scene feels almost carnivalesque. The city is wide open, and the soldiers are enjoying this respite from their years trapped inside the walls. Homer ends this book of the poem with a complex simile. Whoops, there we go. So with hearts made high, these sat night long by the outworks of battle, and their watchfires blazed numerous about them. It's when in the sky the stars about the moon's shining are seen in all their glory, when the air has fallen to stillness, and all the high places of the hills are clear, and the shoulders out jutting, and the deep ravines as endless bright air spills from the heavens. And all the stars are seen to make glad the heart of the shepherd. Such in their numbers blazed the watchfires the Trojans were burning between the waters of Xanthos and the ships before Ilion. 1,000 fires were burning in the plain, and beside each one sat 50 men in the glare of the blazing firelight. And standing each beside his chariot, champing white barley and oats, the horses waited for the dawn to mount to her high place. I love this simile. So what's going on in it? One thing that's going on in it is that there's a movement of the imagination away from the scene of the fires, far away, right, to the shepherd in the hills, looking up at the stars. I'm reminded when I read this of our students at Wyoming Catholic who go out on a winter trip. In fact, they just went out last week, and they go up into the Tetons, and at night they do cross-country skiing and, build their ice houses and see these stars with this unpolluted sky that this shepherd 3,000 years ago in Homer's simile would have seen. Then you come back down to the fires, which have been immortalized in this kind of vision of the heavens. And then you come back to each fire with the light and warmth of that fire. And then almost like a flash of a camera for a second, the faces of those 50 men around each fire. And then the last movement of the image to those horses leaning over, almost as though the white barley were a kind of meal of stars leaning down to the earth. Gaston Bachelard writes that a particular cosmos forms around a particular image as soon as the poet gives the image the destiny of grandeur. The grandeur of Homer's image pulls us directly into the cosmos of the poem and its unfolding drama. These Trojans would not be spending the night outside the city had Zeus not nodded his head to Achilles' mother Thetis at the end of Book 1 and promised to give Achilles honor. By the end of Book 8, the absence of Achilles from the fighting has drawn these Trojans out onto the plain, full of a false confidence. Under Hector, they enjoy this night with hearts made high, only because they do not imagine the return of the warrior Achilles. The sense of vastness, the starry sky, the nearby ocean, the walled city, all these give space to the unfolding destiny of Achilles, the hero deprived at his conception of supreme immortality and now being given his poetic compensation. Embedded in this moment of Trojan celebration are already the fires of the destruction of Troy. These households bringing out their food and sweet wine will very soon be ransacked in the passions of war. But for a moment, Homer transcends the dramatic circumstance of war in a scene of clarity and beauty. And although such moments in retrospect reveal more deeply and poignantly the unfolding tragedy, they also remain in the imagination as a promise of a more enduring peace and a truer homeland. The peculiarity of the imagination is nobility, Wallace Stevens wrote during World War II. And this inherent nobility is the natural source of another, which our extremely headstrong generation regards as false and decadent. I mean, Stevens says, that nobility which is our spiritual height and depth, end quote. There's nothing more conspicuously absent from the literature of our own day than the world-making grandeur of the imagination. We feel the urgency of getting past hypersensitive, intersectional grievances and trigger warnings, but how do we begin the ennobling recovery? As Yeats says of the soul in Sailing to Byzantium, it needs to study monuments of its own magnificence, these world-making works that give us the great characters and actions, the enduring metaphors. But precisely those are being rejected. So, suppose we take our cue from Achilles. Instead of letting our great literature be insulted and canceled, we deliberately withdraw it. We deny Homer and Shakespeare, say, to those below a certain income level, or those who identify themselves as belonging to certain social groups. And we greatly encourage letting them read only things that flatter their own current level of knowledge, and implicitly we forbid them to aspire to anything else. This is outrageous. But I am hard-pressed to say what the difference is between this program and Disrupt Text. It's a pleasure to meet someone denied the classics in college who comes upon them later in life and can hardly believe the extent of the earlier deprivation. At places like Hillsdale and Wyoming Catholic College, we study the great tradition of literature in which wisdom adds to wisdom. The Bible, the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, the great plays of Shakespeare and others, the great novels, the great lyrics. We hold on to the past because we hold on to hope. Stevens ends his essay, The Noble Writer and the Sound of Words, with a simile both of consolation and challenge. As a wave is a force and not the water of which it is composed, which is never the same, so nobility is a force, and the manifestations of which it is composed, which are never, and not the manifestations of which it is composed, which are never the same. Nobility of spirit exists now as it has always existed. And more than ever, we need a deeper knowledge of our great literature. Why? To help us cultivate and honor in our students the imagination to renew our institutions and make a new world from the best of the old. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arbery. We now have time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way down to the front.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, do you think that the prevalence of superhero characters in like modern storytelling is a result of the deprivation of like epic heroes?
I think that's a great question. In fact, when I was thinking about the absence of grandeur in literature, I'm really thinking more about sort of mainstream novels and plays and so on. Well, in the popular imagination, I guess we can call it, there's a teeming kind of world of superheroes and semi-gods and so on that's going on. And these have huge popularity. So even when you're trying to get across the nature of the Homeric gods, the temptation is always to say, okay, what's the difference between, say, Captain America and, Iron Man or something? What's the difference between the kind of mutation that leads to some kind of superpowers and mere technological advantage? But I think the impulse is there toward some kind of heightening, some kind of middle way of imagining between ordinary people and the sort of inaccessible divine. So yeah, I think you're onto something there. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. As someone who, and I'm sure there are other people in the room like this, planning on teaching in the future, anything from elementary school all the way up to high school and possibly beyond, I wanted to ask for either a piece of advice or how you yourself have inhabited these aspects of world making and concrete and embodied thought in your own teaching and in your own classes.
Thank you. I think the most important thing to do when you're teaching literature, and I have to say I learned this most of all from Louise Cowan, is to make the students, or to help the student, imagine what's going on in the story. In other words, if you're always going at a poem or a novel in order to extract from it what seems to you the salient idea, you're not treating it as literature. You're treating it as a kind of candy wrapper, and down inside is the real thing. There are always depths to anything that's important in literature, but the first thing to do is to make that effort of imagination which takes you deeply into the story. I remember Louise Cowan teaching Moby Dick when I was a graduate assistant, and she was treating a novel which I had read before but didn't like, and suddenly reading into those scenes of the novel when Ishmael and Queequeg and Starbuck are chasing this huge pod of whales, and suddenly they get drawn into the center, this kind of still center where all the whales are circling around, and they can see down into the depths of the sea at the young leviathans and their mothers. I mean, it's just marvelous. As soon as you get the image, instead of simply concentrating on what seem to you the conceptual parts. I think this is true of children as it is of college students. That is, this is the first thing you do. Imagine into the nature of the world that's being given in that work. What's it like to inhabit a body in that world? I think that's important to always think about. In other words, when you're reading something, you enter it in a body. You have a kind of fictive body or imaginal body, And to the extent that the writer's good, you find yourself grounded and at home in that world. So I think that's a first way to go, right, with that. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. So, being classically educated, we have the opportunity to read these books and to be helped through them. But sometimes, and because of that, some of my favorite books are classics. But how do you do it when you're no longer in school and you're no longer being taught these classics? Are you doomed? Is it once you're out of college and are no longer being taught the classics, you can't enjoy them? How do you enjoy these classic books?
Well, you don't. You just go watch the Avengers, you know? No. I think having people who also like to read them is pretty important. So communities of readers, I think, are vital to anything that you're really going to be able to continue to do. It's great to read these things on your own. It's just, as you say, more difficult. I think it's easier to read novels than it is to read, say, the epic poems. But still, I think you always long for the conversation that goes on about these things. Just as you talk about bosses and colleagues and friends, right? You want to talk about the characters and actions that you read about in this literature because of the way it illuminates, you know, the things around you and gives you a different perspective on what might have gotten stale. If you start seeing your friend as Clytemnestra, you're worried, you know. If you start seeing Penelope in your mother, you know, your mother's striking you as Penelope, tell your dad to go home. All right, you know. It's been 20 years. Go home, Dad. You know, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to that. So obviously when we read these like traditional books, and like the epics especially, we're learning from the experiences of timeless experiences, really. And as you said, wisdom building on wisdom. And in kind of more modern literature, like you were talking about, it's somewhat blind to that like wisdom, so it's hard to build upon that when it isn't there in the first place. So how important is it for us to maybe expose ourselves to the more modern literature when they might make the argument as well that only reading traditional books flatters our own ideas, like we are just like we can say sometimes about the other side?
Yeah, excellent question. I think we should read everything. You know, I read modern novels just as I read the classics. In fact, you know, you're looking all the time, I think, for the work that's going to be a breakthrough, something that's going to really address us in a way that is world-making in the sense I'm speaking of. We need writers who aren't just trying to undercut everything that's good about the tradition, but really try to remake it, you know, to see how to take it into a different social circumstance, political circumstance. What do you do in a world where not everybody believes in God in the same way, right, that Dante's world did? How do you establish that relation between the human and the divine that's so crucial to understanding what it feels like to be in the Homeric world, right? Where are we finding that done? So I think reading modern literature is always a kind of urging of modern writers to take up this challenge and to really try to see what that would be like if you reintroduce the divine, say, into novels. I like the way you put that. Yeah, why aren't we just saying that we're flattering ourselves by reading these same things. Part of my point, and this is something I wish I could have gotten into a little bit more in the paper, is that great literature is always taking those institutions that we want to hold up as permanent and unchanging and, melting them down, rebuilding them, seeing how they can sustain the kind of challenge that, say, Dante gives to the church by putting popes in hell, right? You're putting, and then having the Pope currently in hell say, "Oh, I thought you were the next one. I was kind of waiting for him." Dante is scathing in his criticism of the church, but he's doing it in order to try to restore the institution. Same thing with politics, right? Same thing with marriages. We need to constantly be thinking how to renew the inner being of these institutions, just as we try to renew the world around us with metaphor and such things. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your talk. So I was wondering what you thought of film adaptations of these great classical works, like those of Shakespeare or Homer. I mean, obviously something is lost going from page to screen, and they often take some liberties. But on the other hand, it's a way of exposing a more casual audience who wouldn't read those books naturally to those great stories. So do you think there's a value in that?
Absolutely. In fact, I think, I'll probably draw criticism for this, but I think we're in a great age of a certain form of depiction. It's more or less like the serialized novel. Some of the series, like The Wire or Breaking Bad, you raise your eyebrows, but these are pretty major accomplishments. And I think when you can serialize great books in a way that doesn't diminish, again, the character of the world that's being depicted in those, I think it's a great service. It might tell us that we're back in an oral culture. I don't know, but it's not that Shakespeare's works are written to be handed out, to readers. They're presented as works in the theater. And, and there's a lot of speculation about why Shakespeare himself never even bothered to edit them, for publication. So that kind of, presentation, film, all these things, I think is part of what gets these works across. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. A lot of modern education will require reading some of these more challenging books like The Scarlet Letter and The Odyssey and everything like that. But a lot of students will end up just sparknosing it or not even bothering to read it at all. And a lot of authors are just coming up with interesting plots that don't ask the big questions. So how would you say we change the attitude from trying to find the instant gratification and the entertaining part of these stories to asking the bigger questions and changing our perspectives?
Yeah, good question. It's kind of the question right now, isn't it? I think I was suggesting at the end of my talk, well, you just forbid them to read them. And that'll do it, You may not read The Scarlet Letter. You will never understand it. It's too risque, whatever. There's a way that I think the real loss we face, and I think this is, in large part because of the way that we spend our time on virtual media, on, cell phones and internet, is just simply the loss of the power of concentration. So how to encourage that? At Wyoming Catholic, we forbid cell phones. You may not have a cell phone while you're a student at Wyoming Catholic College. In other words, you don't get to have it when you go back to your dorm room. You don't have one. So that's almost like a gesture, but it's a gesture in the direction of concentration, of the capacity to take some time and to sink into something. in a way that allows you to experience the language of it and those deeper questions that naturally arise from it. It's also good to have people around you in your classes who care deeply about these things and push you, right? So that it's not something that you can easily skate over. Yeah, the Spark Notes world of literature, yeah, that's the great enemy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arbery. I was just curious, it seems like the modern preoccupation with literature is, and the reason that they dismiss the classics is that everyone is preoccupied with feelings. And so the modern authors, they try to get us to try and feel something and not so much to think about something. How would you try to make the argument to the modern thought that, where a well-formed person should cry at the end of the Divine Comedy with the image of the divine, where that should be something that you should have feelings toward?
Yeah. There's a chapter in my book, Why Literature Matters, called The Intelligence of Feeling. And the premise of it is that well-formed feelings contain a great deal of experience and a great deal of thought that's gone into what people have done in what you've read and in what you've experienced in your own life. I look to feeling as a pretty strong key to the truth of things if it's well formed. So I don't want to dismiss feeling. On the other hand, this appeal to sentiment, I thought what Roger Kimball said last night about sentiment was dead on, that there's a kind of sentimentality in fake emotion in a lot of what we see now that isn't earned, it isn't part of what would naturally unfold from the actions and circumstances of a work. You appeal to a certain kind of cultural trope or meme, and that's supposed to be sufficient. It's a cue, cry here, right? Whereas the truly deep works like King Lear, when Cordelia comes out in Lear's arm, it's at the end of that play. If you're not feeling anything there, there's something deeply wrong. So, great question. Thank you.
We now have time for one more question.
Thank you for speaking. I have a question about, you mentioned that literature helps form and helps form us and helps give us the proper dispositions that we should have towards life, and that classical literature is useful or takes a large part in forming us in that way. Do you think that some modern literature can be a deformation or be antithetical to that process? And then should we avoid reading things that do participate in a deformation process? And then how do we avoid those malevolent works?
Again, an important question. I think it's hard to know in advance what a work is going to do to you. I worry about this. I worry about students who have moral qualms, say, about me reading Madame Bovary. They're scared they're going to be tempted in some way. Well, you're going to be tempted toward much worse literature if you don't read it. I think that it's difficult to judge what's deforming if you haven't been formed, right? And if you have been formed, I don't think that the danger of deformation is going to be very powerful. So, I mean, we know certain things are deforming. Pornography is deforming, right? But an honest attempt to give a kind of vision of the world we live in through literature doesn't seem to me deforming unless we are conscious from the outset that, as Keats says, it has a design on you. You know, that it's trying to get you to do something or to think a certain way. If it's an honest attempt to depict the world that we live in and the characters who live in it, I think you have to risk a little bit. Yeah. Good question, though. Thank you. And thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Arbery.